Now, of course, what we want to do is to avoid this road at all costs for Britain. What we have to do is to keep on the road to recovery. And who better to talk about the road to recovery and the threat to that than Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling.
Thank you all very much. The last week of the campaign, you might say, has been a tale of two Nicks. First, there was a lot of focus on national insurance contributions, and then there's been a spotlight cast on Nick Clegg. But you know, the fundamental at the heart of this election has not changed. It's a competing choice of futures. What people are now focusing on, in my view, are the big questions about our country's future. And that's exactly what we're doing today, because Labour is in the future business. Creating a high-tech economy, modernising our infrastructure with high-speed rail, a green investment bank and 400,000 low-carbon jobs, broadband access for everyone, and that will create 500,000 jobs, 1 million more skilled jobs over the next 5 years. This is the new Labour future. It's a bold and ambitious agenda. It is the one worth fighting for. And as I said in the debate on Thursday, every promise that each party makes depends on one thing: a strong economy. Now, the economic indicators show we are continuing to emerge from the recession, but the recovery is fragile. Private sector demand remains weak. So the time when businesses need help most is not next year, but now. In fact, we will not have strong growth next year or the jobs we want in future unless we take the right decisions this year, now. So this is the first question for the election. Who has the best plan to secure the recovery? Who can do it in a way that is fair and gives all people the chance of greater prosperity? I believe that we are in the futures business, but the Tories are in the risk business. Before I call on Alistair, I would draw your attention to Mr. Cameron's statement this morning when he says that the reason for his big idea, his big society, is that the country has run out of money. Let us be clear that this confirms what we've been saying all along. His vision is of DIY, you're on your own public services. Alistair Darling will go through the economic risks now, but be in no doubt that Mr. Cameron's statement this morning confirms the risk to our public services. The big society means big cuts in public services, and it is a risk for our mainstream frontline public services that Britain cannot afford to take. Like a lot about today's Tory party, the big society sounds nice enough, it looks fine, but scratch beneath the surface and you get the same Tory party of old. Is it not astonishing that when he says there is no money left, he can still find the money for his inheritance tax cuts, for the very, very wealthy, and for his marriage tax allowances? I believe that to govern is to choose, and the Conservatives have their priorities wrong. Our priorities are the best for the British people. Alistair.
Thanks. Thank you, Gordon. The Tories were very fond about talking about invitations last week, but there's one they've gone very quiet about. George Osborne wants to hold an emergency budget on 24th of June, but he won't tell people what will be in it. Since the election has called, he has set out a long list of tax credit cuts, but he's silent on the real price to be paid for his promises, or the real impact of his plans to take support out of the economy in just a few weeks' time. So today we're setting out the bill that families would start paying 50 days after a Conservative election victory. The emergency budget would focus on two things. First, it would strip £6 billion out of the economy in 2010, putting the recovery at risk, costing jobs when the private sector is still weak, and leading to cuts in public services. The Tories would also cut child trust funds and child tax credits from families on modest incomes in a matter of months. Second, if George Osborne is to press ahead and implement his pre-election tax cut giveaways, he will need to set out the bill families will have to pay. Just as the decisions we have taken over the last 18 months have been crucial in stabilising the economy, so the choices we make in the coming months are vital. We are on the road to recovery. Growth returned at the turn of the year, exports have picked up, and unemployment has stabilised, although we remain vigilant. And the impact of the recession on families and firms has been less severe than many once feared. Our response has been very different to that of the 1990s. We refused to stand aside when people's jobs were under threat, providing £5 billion to ensure Job Centre Plus could continue to get people back into work and guaranteeing all young people a job or training after 6 months out of work. We stepped in to keep people in their homes with help with mortgage payments for those out of work. As a result, repossessions have been much lower than in the 1990s. With businesses, we have provided help by allowing firms to defer their tax payments. We introduced the car scrappage scheme. Business insolvencies are running at less than half the rate seen in the 1990s. And this month, the OECD has reported that the UK is seeing one of the most robust returns of growth in the developed world. But the OECD also set out that things are still fragile and underscored the need for caution. There are clear risks that must be avoided. This morning, the Item Club agreed, flagging the risks of a double-dip recession. So whilst we can be encouraged, we are not yet out of the woods. Now is a dangerous time to be making cuts, but George Osborne seems oblivious to these warnings. All over the world, countries are maintaining support for their economies into this year, but in the UK, if the Conservatives had their way, we would be out on a limb, with £6 billion less support for the economy this year. Now, last week, some of our leading economists could not have been clearer. They wrote, "Spending cuts will derail our recovery." They said, "The first step is to make sure that growth returns and thus tax receipts recover. Rash action now could imperil not only jobs, but also the prospects for reducing the deficit." The Tories are wrong on the recovery and would push the deficit higher, not lower. Now, this is not some abstract choice. Cuts made in the current climate, when private sector demand is weak, will have a real instant impact on jobs. The Tories have said they will take £6 billion out of public spending this year in their emergency budget, and that these cuts will be delivered easily, they say, with additional efficiency savings. But we are already delivering £15 billion of savings this year, and the Tories have no credible plans to go further. More importantly, they would make their cuts when the financial year is already well underway, making proper planning very, very difficult. And I agree with the efficiency expert Jerry Grimstone, the chairman of Standard Life, who in the Financial Times described the Tory plans as, and I quote, "just not credible." The result is that the immediate Tory cuts would have a real impact on public services. The Tories have said that some departments will be protected, like health and defence, but they have refused to set out how the remaining departments would be affected. That is, despite Martin Reid, who now advises them, saying, and I quote, "the Tories have the numbers, and it's for the Tories to disclose them." We are setting out today what the impact of these cuts could be if they fell in proportion to each department's level of spending. Our analysis confirms what the IFS have already said. The largest unprotected area would be schools, with the Department of Children, Schools and Families share being over £1.7 billion this year. I want to illustrate the scale of the problems that the Tories face. If we apply the same approach to government spending on schools and on the cost of employing teachers in particular, we can see what the impact of these cuts on teacher numbers would be. A pro rata application shows that cuts shared out on that basis would lead to a reduction of 14,000 teachers this year. If the police were to face their share of in-year reductions this year, we could see 2,400 fewer police on the streets. Alongside these cuts, the Tories' emergency budget would implement the cuts they plan for family benefits. Child trust funds would be removed from families with incomes just a little over £16,000, who, in George Osborne's words, are the better off. And tax credits cut for families who are far from rich, with incomes as low as £31,000. The priority now is to secure the recovery, but making the right decisions now will also lay the ground for the growth that we want to see in years to come. I'm optimistic about Britain's economic future. If we make the right judgments now and we take a responsible approach, I am confident we'll see a return to strong growth next year. And this morning, the Item Club agreed. David Cameron has shown himself to lack the judgment so crucial in times like these. Lacking experience, he's been blown about by events. He opposed the government's action to support the economy because he said the deficit must be tackled as the first priority. He argued that not to do so were, in his words, moral cowardice. So the deficit was their top priority. Then, with the election called, the Tories threw caution to the wind and went for broke. A marriage tax giveaway costing £500 million and a promise to go further still turned out to be more important. When campaigning in the South West, opposing rises on cider duty was what matters most. Partly reversing the national insurance changes also came ahead of credibility on the deficit, even though the increase is not planned for another year when growth will be underway. And the Tories planned for an inheritance tax giveaway of £200,000 for the richest 3,000 estates was too high a priority to be sacrificed in straitened times, even it was no longer their one pledge on tax. George Osborne has set out his election tax giveaways, but he can't hide from the price tag, because when a budget comes round, it's all got to add up. In opposition, warm words, but in government, these tax cuts come at a price, which is what we're setting out today. The bill George Osborne has in store for the British people in his emergency budget to pay for the tax giveaways underpinning his election campaign. And the elements we are illustrating today merely cover his tax promises, not the spending promises that can be properly costed. But there's more, many with significant price tags of their own. Even on this selective list, there's a big bill waiting. £38 billion over the Parliament. £38 billion that could only be found by borrowing more, spending less, or raising further taxes. To stick to Labour's existing deficit reduction plan, the Tories would have to raise taxes or cut spending, hitting each household with a bill of £1,500 over the Parliament in the budget they want to give on 24th June. And this is all before we take account of any Tory plan to deliver on their promise to go further and faster on the deficit. If I had announced such an uncosted giveaway in my budget in March, but was unable to show exactly how I'd pay for it, or for what I thought government should be borrowing, people would rightly have said the plan was not credible. And that's the point. David Cameron and George Osborne are guilty of reckless opportunism. George Osborne wants to be Chancellor in just 3 weeks' time, and what he's proposed simply isn't believable. His emergency budget would leave families feeling cheated. This is not about an election campaign. It's about the future of the country. George Osborne needs to be straight with people about the risks with the public finances and the economy that he's proposing to take. If George Osborne was to deliver his budget on 24th of June, the country would pay a very heavy price.
So the point is simply this. What George Osborne wants everyone to believe is that you can simply whip £6 billion out of the economy this year, and that this will not set back the recovery of the economy from recession. That you can simply throw caution to the wind with a series of tax giveaways in following years, and that nobody will have to pick up the bill for this. No wonder he doesn't want to tell anyone about the price that they're going to have to pay. So voters should be very well aware. If you vote Tory in May, you're going to be stung in June. Thank you.